I'll get you, Gadget. Maybe not this time, maybe not next time, but I'll get you. That's my cat Enzo. In the meantime, we're going to make a desk. I've even made plans that we can ignore while we build it. The only desk I've built before was a simple writing desk for my mom, but that was enough to tell me I'd have a lot of work in store for me making this much more complicated computer desk. I started out by jointing some of the walnut boards so that I could glue a few of them together to use for the legs. This is around the time that I bought a good hand plane so that I could even those out once the glue had dried. With one side even, I could take it to the table saw to cut out the legs. For most of this project, I was going to use some cheap plywood that I had sitting around and just sand it down and put some veneer on it. So I rough cut everything with my circular saw before taking it to the table saw for the precise cuts. Then I found I had this weird problem where the cuts weren't 90 degrees, and it was because my table saw's fence was slightly skewed. I don't know when that happened or how, but now you can probably guess my motivation for making the giant crosscut sled in a previous video. With everything actually square, then I could cut out the veneer and stick it onto the wood and then just use some pressure to get it on there good. I tried to line up the grain so that it would look a little bit more natural. I ended up finding that using a really sharp knife and just making one pass worked a lot better than trying to score it multiple times. Then I could move on to making the marks for where I wanted to drill the holes for the dowels. I used this simple jig to line them up. And then for the legs and the pieces in between the plywood with the cherry veneer, I could take it to my drill press that I kept set for this whole project so that it would always have the same reveal. It ended up taking a bit of coercion to get all the pieces together because I found that the dowels weren't always perfectly straight when I glued them in. So I should have been a little bit more careful with those, but eventually it worked out. There was a lot of gluing of panels for this thing and a lot of very similar work, so I tried to batch it up. I did a lot of dry test fitting and then found problem areas such as where there were gaps, so I could cut off little shims and bits and pieces here and there to try to put in place to get rid of some of the more unsightly mistakes I had made. I was a little bit nervous once I could finally glue together all these pieces to make sort of the box that would go on each side, because there were a lot of pieces to line up and some of them took a fair bit of coercion to get into place, but mallets and clamps solved that and things seemed to line up. As I was getting ready to do the next one, I noticed that one of the pieces of walnut was actually a little bit more proud of the legs than I wanted, so I planed it down and then repeated the same kind of glue up process. had some 3/4 inch plywood with cherry veneer on it that looked really nice, but I bought it a few months back, and when my water heater leaked, it was not friendly and ruined some edges, so I had to cut those off. But once that was ready, I could drill the holes for the dowels and start putting it together. My idea was to use 2 of the pieces of cherry and join them with a piece of walnut in the middle, so it would look a little bit more intentional. The desktop wasn't going together the way I wanted it to, so I think I need to make some simple clamps out of 2x4s, but I was getting a little frustrated with that part of the project. When that happens, it's usually time to take a break, or in this case, I need to keep making progress, so I'm going to work on a different part of the project, which is to make the drawer pulls that I'll end up using later. The lathe is one of my absolute favorite tools. I always enjoy using it, and it always puts me in a good mood. These drawer pulls were very simple, kind of like making a pen, except there's just one single piece for each pull. And once you have that shaped and finished, you just clamp the 2 end pieces on, and it looks pretty nice. Then it was time to start making the drawers. I did these fairly simply, mostly using the table saw, and again using some cheap plywood that I still had around from another project. One of these days I'll try some dovetails, but not this time. Once I got all the pieces cut out, I could fit everything and make sure it was good, glue it together, and clamp it. Once it had dried, I could come back and put some edge banding just around the top to make it look a little bit nicer. One of the things I hadn't thought about is, since the plywood pieces were inset from the walnut, I actually had to add in a few pieces of scrap plywood to have a flush surface for actually mounting the hardware onto, so the drawer pulls would have somewhere to go. So I just used some scraps for spacers to space the drawer pulls from the bottom, and also to space the drawer up from the bottom. I cut out some solid cherry pieces to use as the drawer fronts and tried to get as good of a fit as I could. And then I just screwed those in from the back side. I used some scrap paper underneath too to make sure that they weren't rubbing against the walnut when I pulled them out. And then I just drilled the holes and put in the screws from inside to get those handles on. Since I still wasn't eager to get to the top at this point, I thought I'd get ahead by sanding things down, cleaning it off, and then applying some finish to the pieces I had done so far. This turned out to not save me a whole lot of time because of the number of times I had to clean it and reapply. And I think I put it on too thick the first time, so I came back and sanded quite a bit before going with thinner layers that worked out a lot better. But at least I felt like I was making progress. Then I came back to the top and decided I would just cut off that section of walnut that I had put in there, and I would go with a tongue and groove system instead. So I got one of the few pieces of walnut that I had left that was wide enough, and I cut the grooves into that, and it was a really tight fit, which made me very happy. So I put some glue in that and let it set, and then I came back to put on the other piece. And I don't know how, but somehow the other piece ended up being extremely loose. So the desktop has solidified and doesn't look great. There's a pretty massive gap between the walnut and the cherry. And on this side, you can also see the cherry plywood is sticking out quite a bit more. I don't know how I did that because this side is correct the way it should be, because I wanted to just trim down that walnut. I had a few really long scraps of walnut from when I had helped my dad make a cutting board last year. So I cut out the rough knots in those and then took them to the table saw to make sure they were all the same width. In cutting them to the same width, that created some really long thin scraps that I was able to plane down into sort of thin wedges that I could then stick in that gap in the desktop, and I could fill in that terrible gap. It took a lot of little pieces and a lot of playing with it, but in the end I'm glad I took the time to do this because it ends up looking a lot better. So I just used a flush trim saw to cut those little bits off. And then I went back to working on the trim around the desktop. And once I got it close with the miter saw, that's when I could take it to my shooting board from the other video. So now you know the motivation for that one as well. And I ended up using epoxy to put that on because I didn't have any clamps long enough for going from end to end. Maybe it's about time I get some pipe clamps. The miters turned out really well, and then I just had to use the hand plane to get the trim down flush, and then I used a little baby block plane to just smooth over the edge so it wasn't quite so sharp. Then I could start putting on the finish, which was a polyurethane satin finish. Again, I used too thick of a first coat, so I sanded it down a little bit and then came back with a much thinner coat, and I ended up coming back to it several times to end up getting it to look a lot better. But while that was drying, it was time to move on to the door finally that goes below the drawers. And it wasn't quite square for some reason, so I did a little bit of work to get that right. And the idea here is that this would just be a simple door that's almost always closed, but it could house my ups and my external RAID array or my external hard drives. And they have a bunch of cords coming out the back, so I can leave that big hole or empty space in the back for all those cords. And then I could put in these nice hinges in the front that are soft close so that when I do need to get in there, I don't have to worry about it slamming shut. This was another place where I ended up having to add a scrap of plywood on the inside to get things flush for the hinges. But you mostly don't see it, and the door is going to be closed most of the time anyway. Then I noticed that it closed too far. So I took just this little scrap of walnut and used some chisels just with hand pressure to shape out this little stopper piece and smooth it over on the sander so that I could just glue it into place, and it would fit kind of where the walnut pieces stuck out more, but the plywood on the side was in a little bit, and then the soft close would actually close with the same reveal as the drawers. Then it was time to attach the back piece that connects the two sort of big boxes. And somehow I managed to drill holes in one of the wrong sides, which was the back, so I had to fill those in. But initially I thought that I could just do that back piece and use one clamp as a spreader to put everything in place, but that didn't work real well, so I cut out that thin piece of walnut to balance out the front of it. While that was drying, I could start working on the keyboard tray, which was just another piece of veneered plywood with edge banding around it. But for the front, I wanted to add walnut so that it would kind of look a little bit more cohesive with the rest of the front of the desk. And then I just added some really cheap drawer pulls for this, and I started to apply some more finish. Sorry about that, I think the fumes make me a little crazy. But then I just poured some water on the top to make sure it beat it up, so I knew I had enough finish. And then I was using the tabletop fasteners. So I just adjusted the marking gauge and made some marks, and then I used chisels to cut out some little holes for those to line up with. The problem I ended up finding was that since the desk was assembled, every time I was hitting it, kind of the whole thing was rebounding every time, even when I put my legs against it to try to hold it in place. So it was putting a lot of pressure all across the desk the whole time, and eventually it broke the back piece loose. So I roughly pulled it out of the other side and used that opportunity to actually chisel with it on a sawhorse, which worked 1,000 times better. Then I could pull out the dowel, or try to. That didn't work, so I cut it off and just drilled right back into that spot. I'm just a little unlucky. When I decided to put it back together, I put fresh dowels in and used epoxy again, which was quickly becoming my friend. And using a clamp, I could get that much tighter. Finally, I could put the desktop on and actually start putting the tabletop fasteners in place. Just used an awl to make the hole, or the mark for the hole, drilled a little bit into it, and then I used the drill to put in the screw. Later on I ended up using a screwdriver because it actually worked a lot better than the drill. And then I decided to just put a hole in the desk for the fun of it. Actually, it does have a purpose, but what I didn't show on camera is that I drilled from the underneath also to prevent it from splitting out. At this point, I was just exhausted. This was my first time ever making detailed plans on a computer for a project, and I actually made several variations of the desk in software before making the real thing out of wood. And you'll see I had originally had the idea of kind of a big shelf here, and I thought that the monitors could sit on that, but then I ended up getting a dual monitor arm thing that comes up and puts them up out of the way, so I decided that wasn't necessary. And that's what this hole is right there. I didn't do that just to upset people. Overall, the project turned out well. It was a huge amount of work. If I were to do it again, I would do so many things differently. Where to start? I would cut all the plywood oversized, apply the veneer to that, and then cut it down to size. That would give much better edges. I also should have been using cauls when I was gluing multiple pieces together, and the little things like where I didn't clamp this together well and I had this gap, the pieces I filled it in with actually turned out fine. It gives it a little bit of character, so that's good enough. But now the not so fun part, taking it upstairs and putting all my stuff on it.